Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today I'll be showing you all the different dyes in Minecraft and what you can do with them. I also love to live stream on Twitch at twitch.tv/readrit. Link will be in the description. Please note that some information in this video could change depending on what version of Minecraft that you are playing on. So our first dye is red dye, which you can get by crafting beetroot into red dye, a red tulip into red dye, or you can craft a poppy or rosebush into red dye. Then the next dye is blue dye, which you get from crafting a cornflower or lapis into blue dye. The next dye is yellow dye, which you get from crafting a daisy or a sunflower into yellow dye. The next dye is green dye, which you get from crafting a cactus into green dye. The next dye is brown dye, which you get from crafting cocoa beans. The next dye is white dye, which you get from crafting bone meal into white dye. Next dye is black dye, which you get from crafting an ink sac into black dye. Next dye is orange dye, which you can get by combining yellow and red dye, or you can craft an orange tulip into orange dye. Next dye is gray dye, which you get by combining black dye and white dye. The next dye is light gray dye, which you get by combining gray dye and white dye. The next dye is lime dye, which you get by combining green and white dye. The next dye is light blue dye, which you get by combining blue and white dye, or you can craft a blue orchid into blue dye. The next dye is cyan dye, which you get from combining green dye and blue dye. The next dye is purple dye, which you get from combining red and blue dye. The next dye is pink dye, which you get from combining white dye and red dye, or you can craft a peony or pink tulip into pink dye. And last dye is a magenta dye, which you get by combining purple dye and pink dye, or you can craft a lilac or a lilium into magenta dye. So one thing you can do with dyes is you can actually craft a different colored dye. So if I have a white dye and a blue dye, I have a white wool and a blue dye. So if I combine that with a dye, I get blue wool. So that's pretty cool. The next thing you can do with dyes is you can actually dye sheep, which is really cool. So you can right click on them and you can dye, but if you don't like a color, you can also re-dye them until you find a color that you like. The next thing you can do with dyes is you can actually craft dyed glass using dyes. So you just put one dye in the center and then you can put glass all around it and you can get dyed glass or stained glass. Next thing you can do with dyes is you can actually make different colors of terracotta. So you can put a dye in the middle, sort of like the recipe for stained glass. Then you can move the terracotta all around it, and then you can get different colored terracotta. Next thing you can do with dyes is you can dye leather armor by combining a pink dye, and you get a pink leather chest plate, or you can, if you don't, you can also change the color and you can get a mix. Next thing you can do with dyes is you can make fireworks stars. So I can use this light blue dye and orange dye and combine it and get a fireworks star. Another thing you can do with dyes is you can actually dye shulker boxes. So I can make the shulker box green, or I can change it and make a light blue shulker box, which is cool. Next thing you can do with dyes is you can actually dye beds by putting your bed, and you can combine the dye and you can make different colored beds with dyes. Next thing you can do with dyes is you can make concrete powder by combining different colored dyes and with sand and gravel, and then you can get different color concrete powder. Next thing you can do with dyes is you can also, you might have seen me earlier talk about this, but just again, you can combine different colored dyes into other dyes, which is cool. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. Don't forget to subscribe if you aren't subscribed already. Definitely go check out my Twitch at twitch.tv/readrit, and I will see you guys in the next video.